I'm Alistair Wilkins. I'm here in the Shetland Islands. Not the Shetlands. I've already been corrected on that point at least once. And the reason why I've come to this remote island chain hundreds of miles north of mainland Scotland, and believe me, I have the all-night ferry ride and what the crew promised me were mild waters to prove it, is because I've come in search of a story. And because the Shetland Islands, while remote, are by no means isolated. For hundreds of years, they've been at the center of political intrigues and trade routes and all sorts of other much larger events. But this isn't about that. This is about one house here in the southern part of the main island, Shetland, that didn't make it.
You're standing at the old house of Broo. This is what you've come to see. Now you're at it.
The first thing you notice when you visit the Shetland Islands is what isn't there.
It's almost a treeless landscape, and that takes a little bit of getting used to.
Oh, how barren it was. The lack of trees catches you if you're from the eastern United States. It's extraordinary.
It's almost like you're living in a washed out watercolor where it's hard to find the margins of the land and sea and air.
It is quite psychologically impressive what it feels like to be on a landscape with no trees. And I think that it gives you a whole different sense of the environment because you can see, there are long vistas, you can see for miles, you can see coastline for miles.
And that treeless landscape means there's no hiding from the first thing you hear and feel in Shetland, the wind. Winds in Shetland average 15 miles per hour, and winds frequently reach double that speed or more. The wind is a big part of how the environment has always shaped daily life in Shetland, even into the 21st century.
Because of our geographical location, which we're 60 degrees north on the periphery of the Arctic Circle, crafting here can be very vulnerable, plus the fact that we have problems with weather at times, where if you're going out to do a day's work, same as hay curing, sometimes you're putting in work which 3 days into one just because of knowing that the weather could deteriorate.
Plenty of people have to be very aware of it because they make their living from the land and from the sea. So if the weather isn't behaving itself, then folk won't be able to make a living.
Have your plans and aspirations for what you want to get done if the weather allows, and then you should have to work around it.
I discovered all this firsthand when I came to the Shetland Islands in December 2015. I traveled 4,000 miles across the Atlantic, caught a 7-hour train ride from London to Aberdeen, and then that 12-hour all-night ferry to reach Lerwick, the capital of the Shetland Islands and the biggest town. All that remained was a half-hour drive to the southern tip of Shetland, on the left side of the road, let's not forget, to find what I had come in search of. And one of the first things I learned once I got there is the wind is a real pain for any filmmaker foolish enough to interview outside, as you're about to hear. But that's just the beginning.
This whole area here, you can see there are pretty massive sand dunes covering a fairly large area. And this, in the 1600s, there was a lot of sand blow, and we believe it covered over what used to be the House of Broo, which was the residence of the lairds, the Sinklers.
Yes, 4 centuries ago, this same wind began to blow beach sands inland. In the direct path of the sand stood one of the island's most prosperous townships.
It's this curious situation. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, Broo was one of the richest landed estates in Shetland. Beautiful arable land with an important landowner.
Well, I think when the people settled there, they were obviously attracted to a fertile valley. There was an access to fresh water, beautiful beach with all of the resources associated with that. The people who settled on the eastern side of the valley, I'm sure, had no idea that they were in the worst possible place.
The Broo site likely started as a collection of small tenant farms, rented from the laird. The cruel irony is the same sands that doomed Broo would also have been what first attracted these people to that part of Shetland.
Certainly in the southmost part of Shetland, the presence of sand is good for agriculture.
A small amount of sand kind of keeps the soil light and adds, depending on whether it's shell sand or quartz sand, can add nutrient to the soil.
But you can have too much of a good thing.
Too much, in this case, were the large sand dunes of Quendel Beach.
The setting at Broo is that you have this horseshoe-shaped valley that slopes up from the big dunes, and the storm winds must have carried the sand inland. So it's a really unique setting.
When you deal with sand dunes that are 10, 15 meters or higher, there's a lot of sand. And when it starts to break down, once the vegetation is gone on the surface, you've opened up this large volume of sand to being blown. And once it starts, it continues and can continue for a century or more.
In 1774, about a century after the sands began to blow, a visitor to Shetland described what he saw. Here lay the estate of Broo, now a mere wilderness, occasioned by the blowing of a small dusty kind of sand, which never possibly can rest, as the least puff of wind sets it all in motion, in the same manner as the drifting snows of winter. In a windy day, this spot is an Arabian desert in miniature. Here the clouds of sand flying as far as the eye can reach, there the crowds of travelers, scarce to be seen for the drifting sand, riding to church. This dramatic scene represented the end of the House of Broo, but it was also the beginning of a modern effort to understand Broo's story. Leading this research is Bates College archaeologist Gerald Bigelow.
That was a starting point that we knew probably by the mid-18th century the catastrophe had happened. And so one of the big goals of the project was to find out when the process began and what caused it and how people who were living in that area reacted to it as it was unfolding.
The earliest surviving record of the Broo disaster is a 1684 survey, which describes the area as nothing but blowing sand, whereas within these 50 years it was all cornland and pleasant meadows. We still don't know precisely when and how the sands began to blow, but local history has one possible explanation.
The story that's been handed down the generations of the old house of Broo, and it's on the property of Mr. John Leslie, was that it was a severe sandstorm that hit the south mainland of Shetland many years ago, and as time progressed with wind in that particular area was covered by sand. I can even take you and could show you examples of where there was it's almost a straight divide between where the sand stopped and we came into the heavier, blacker earth.
The next day, I took Allison Duncan, the flea to his friends, up on his offer as we headed outside to see the sands that once buried Broo. The wind was there to greet us.
The whole area around here, and you can see the sand dunes down before you, that's all, with the human eye there, is all sand. That's the district of Quendel, all those houses you see over there, and from those houses going eastwards in this direction is all sand. That's Quendel Bay out there, Quendel Beach, which is the largest beach in Shetland, and it's all sand. And the dunes behind it, likewise, is all sand. That's Quendel Farm over there, and all the green arable fields that you see over there are all sand as well. So this shows you the area where the sandstorm hit the South Mainland many years back.
Later in our journey through Allison Duncan's land, he showed me the precise point today where sand meets soil.
That's where the ground that I own is the dividing line between the black, heavier soil going towards the road or to the eastward, and from that strainer right down, the flat ground down there, it's solid sand.
To see how the blowing sands mixed with the environment during the time of Broo, you have to visit not Shetland, but Bates College in Maine.
The big sand that I've seen is working on the sediment cores with microtel. So we're, in addition to trying to figure out how humans or these people are actually living in this this house as it gets inundated with sand. I've been working with Microtel as well on the sediment cores from the nearby lakes to see what's going on with the watersheds. And so in those cores you see a massive slug of sand that just blows in at a certain period of time. It's pretty interesting.
What we're looking at here is a core from the Loch of Broo, which is just north of the Broo site. So the sediment that accumulates on the bottom is really organic rich. That's this fudgy brown color. And an interesting thing to note here is the upper unit. There's a very distinctive yellow unit in here. This is a sand unit, a very fine sand unit, which, you know, our working hypothesis is that the sand unit is related to the sand blows that buried the Broo site. And it looks like there's a couple different units, like not just one pulse. There's like one pulse, a second, and maybe a third pulse of sand that reached, you know, could be as far from the Quendel lowlands all the way up to the Loch of Broo. And this makes a lot of sense because some of the homes up in recent times have been sandblasted up on that hillside. In any case, you see that, you know, prior to this sandy unit, there was organic matter growing, accumulating in the lake basin, this period of sand accumulation in the lake, and then it's kind of a lighter color organic matter here that's a sandy, there's a little bit of sand that accumulates. So it's not a pure organic like this one. There's a little bit of sand. So after the main sand blow, I think the soil in the region has become sandy, and that's the cause of the lighter color up here. There are little thin layers of sand that are kind of wispy little layers here. This is really a neat observation that we have this very distinctive sand, and that sand accumulation kind of alternates with organic accumulation after the region was inundated by sand, because it's continuing to wash in off the soils.
Back in Shetland, as the flea and I headed deeper into muddy fields for which my shoes were not at all prepared, he pointed out another feature of the modern dunes.
In all those sand dunes that you see there, and you can see where the rabbits has been burrowing into the face.
Scottish settlers first brought rabbits to Shetland a couple centuries before the Broo disaster. That's one of several human actions that could have destabilized the dunes.
You've got the introduction of sheep and cattle, sheep primarily. So the hooved animals wreak havoc on the vegetation.
We don't know how much human actions played a part. Cutting grass for thatching roofs, for bedding for animals, rushes on floors, introduction of rabbits, overgrazing potentially by domestic animals brought in. So all of that may have had a component. Tilling of the soil, how much that exposed land for wind activity, and then the storms associated with the Little Ice Age with intense winds.
And historically, we try to speak of sufficient causes or necessary causes or approximate causes. Approximate cause is just something that happens immediately prior to the result. A necessary cause is you have to have that to have the result, and a sufficient cause is that explains it. And we haven't really found a sufficient cause. But I think the climatic deterioration is a necessary cause along with these other things.
A very prominent climate historian named H.H. Lamb, who wrote the first big compendium of climate history, global climate history, and he was actually quite interested in sand movements on coastlines in especially the North Sea and the British North Atlantic regions. And he proposed that there are actually periods at which sand got moving in coastal sand environments. And the period that he thought was the most prolific of these events was the Little Ice Age. And that was really the beginning of my interest in the whole possible connection between climate change and the archaeology of coastal settlements that had been buried in sand.
Unlike climate change today, which has seen global temperatures rise more than 1 degree Fahrenheit since 1900, the late 17th century saw a particularly severe period of global cooling. This was part of the Little Ice Age, which lasted in Europe from about the 16th to the 19th century. Contemporary paintings depict people on an ice-choked River Thames in London and on frozen waterways in Holland. But these icy scenes only hint at the environmental devastation Europe was experiencing.
The time when the Broo site was abandoned comes during a period we call the Little Ice Age. Colder than present, stormier than present, and a time when other communities in the region were also succumbing to the same sort of thing.
It was cooler because there'd been a number of advances of glaciers in the alpine regions of Europe during the period from about 1550 to about 1800. A lot of the glaciers in Switzerland and Austria, Italy and etc. began to advance.
And as a result of that, all sorts of things went wrong. Trade was disrupted, disease started. In Shetland, for instance, in 1700 there was a massive smallpox epidemic which had a huge effect on the population as a whole. The late 17th century in Shetland, in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in the world as a whole is a catastrophe.
It's difficult to say just how tightly we can link climate change and historical turmoil, but there's good reason to think settlements across Europe suffered the same fate as Broo.
A lot of settlements were inundated with blowing sand because of storm deposition across the North Atlantic during the Little Ice Age, and this is one of many sites in the British Isles and the Faroes and places like that.
While the settlement was being buried in sand, the Scottish Parliament was actually passing an act that banned the pulling of vegetation in sandy areas on coastlines, specifically because coastal areas were farms were being overrun by sand. And so in Edinburgh, in the national capital, there was an understanding of things that could both cause and, in a sense, prevent this type of catastrophe.
So it's something that's happening across the board, and there are these kind of fragments of documentary evidence that you find in that way, like laws and rules being made about different things.
It's very unlikely it was connected to what was happening in Shetland. It actually reflects what probably was another coastal sand disaster that was in the county of Fife, which is just north of Edinburgh, in which a whole township was buried there in a similar type of disaster. And so even then there was some understanding about these issues.
Still, this would have been little consolation for those in Broo watching their home disappear beneath the sand. It's only now, 3 centuries later, that the House of Broo has re-emerged. Though I had made the 4,000-mile trip to the Shetland Islands, I hadn't actually expected to see the site for myself. I have the flea to thank for that.
You're standing at the old House of Broo. This is what you've come to see. Now you're at it. And as you can see, there's plastic sheeting, there's netting and old car tires put around it to save it from the Shetland weather. The wind here can be very, very strong at times, especially when it's westerly. You get flants and gusts coming off that big hill. But you can see all the work that they've done here. You can come in over here and see for yourself. And I mean, look at the lovely stonework that's there. You can see there. You see, this is the house, and they believe it that the byre or the barn was attached to the house as well. And they firmly believe, if they had the money, that that nearest mound just out over the fence here, they're convinced that there's a similar type of maybe building underneath that mound is what they found here. And this is the stonework as they found it, as they dug away the sand. And you take them back to America, they'll be able to explain to you exactly in more detail of what their conclusions are. You have the evidence here now. It's just getting the professional people to explain the whole setup of this building.
Buried beneath tires and netting, it's strange to imagine this site was once someone's home, part of a larger estate of farms that people defended for years against the endless sand.
I mean, it just doesn't go away. It wasn't just the storm. The storm may have started it, or overgrazing may have started it, or people collecting grass for thatch may have started it. But once begun, the process just continues.
The verbs that are used in the petitions from Shetland to the Crown in explanation of why the big landowners are not paying their Crown rents, the verb is blasted. It says this is entirely blasted. Our lands are entirely blasted and continuing to be blasted. And you can trace that kind of language and the fact that no one's paying any taxes for a long period of time into the 18th century.
So we could suspect that people saw this coming. I mean, the sand didn't get to them immediately, but just came closer and closer, and they probably took actions to possibly move their structures, protect them in some way, before they finally succumbed to the fact they couldn't stop the sand.
The archaeological evidence suggests this was life under siege. The research at Broo reveals the ingenious ways the estate's occupants adapted to live in a sand-covered landscape for years, even decades.
Often, I think temptation is to think of people in the past as being quite primitive and kind of people's intelligence and knowledge just growing exponentially. But I think that's incorrect, because people knew a lot more about living with the land and how to generally work alongside nature, animals, the elements, than we do. We've lost so much of that knowledge now, and that's one reason why within this project Jerry's kind of very keen to drill down and try and rediscover some of that knowledge about how to work in a harsh environment.
So they were dealing with sand probably blowing almost every day. There are some areas where excavations have shown layers of sand, layers of organic material, probably from penned animals, another layer of sand. So perhaps related to storms, but sand moving around constantly and trying to keep this out of the house.
Even on site, people adapted. I mean, they probably went from the complex of buildings to one building, and they even adapted to the sand blowing in by adding steps to get out of their, to get out of the building after a while.
In the last part of the site that was occupied, there's evidence that at this point the landscape right outside the building was actually growing, was getting higher and higher, that they actually built little informal stone stairs into the accumulating sand, and also there's some cultural material in there, the midden layers, but they built these informal stairs to make it easier to essentially climb out of their house.
In that same area, that sandy area behind what is now Quendel Beach, or the Quendel Sands, there was a story about an old church that had been there, which had been abandoned at some stage in the 1700s due to shifting sand. And that was known as the Cross Kirk.
We don't know exactly how long it took for the people of Broo to abandon their home, but it's possible entire generations spent their time fighting back the sand, living in a state of gradual, inexorable retreat.
It really looks like that people moved from down along the shore up the valley through time.
One adaptation that may be reflected in the architecture of the house is it appears that this may have started out as a tenant farm, and then it looks quite certainly, when it was abandoned, it had been lived in by the owners of the entire township. It was lived in by the landlords, the proprietors, or in Scottish terms, the lairds, just before it was abandoned, because we're finding evidence of artifacts that were expensive at the time and, you know, were symbols of prestige.
Some of the objects that he's found, which do suggest that it was fairly high status, include 3 items that were made out of elephant ivory, which is astounding. I don't know, nobody knows whether or not elephant ivory was common in Shetland or whether it was just a specific contact or specific trade or something to this particular individual who had it. But that seems a bit bizarre, to have elephant ivory in Shetland in the 17th century.
Also, there's a room that was added onto the building that looks as if it was meant to be a reflection of status, the architecture of the room. So that was one adaptation, and it's possible that their farm was closer to the source of the sand and got overwhelmed early in the process, and they took over a farm that was farther away from the source of the sand, hoping that the expansion of it would stop. And then ultimately they had to abandon that site.
Imagine they would have adapted and adapted and adapted until they couldn't adapt anymore, you know, and put up with it for as long as they could, because maybe where else could they have gone?
Very late in the burial of this site, when people were still there, it's also clear that they were doing things like building little walls to try to keep sand out of particular areas of the building complex, which, when you see this, is a sign of desperation and how bad things were. They were almost doing the equivalent of setting up snow fences, you know, in the winter to keep the sand from drifting into their living spaces.
I imagine it would have been quite fertile agricultural land there, and they wouldn't have wanted to leave that. Sandy soil is good for growing things. Close to the beach, that's good for transport. So it would have been a prime site, and they would have held on to it for as long as they could.
If you think of a really hard winter in New England, and the way snow accumulates and starts to, you know, turn to ice in places, after a while people end up walking on ice and snow rather than the original ground surface until it all melts in the spring. But this is a case in which it couldn't melt. People just abandoned the settlement.
And for all their ingenuity, there were some things the people of Broo just couldn't know in the 17th century that their descendants now use to get the most out of their sandy fields.
If you raise sheep on the grass that now exists on the sand there, you have to give them cobalt supplements or they won't thrive. And that's something that was discovered, and today you can get cobalt supplements, and so, you know, sheep are raised on that land there. People in the 18th century, for example, would not have known that.
If it's a sandy field that you're working or rotating, what the farmers or crofters do now is, once they've sown the seed and they take their slurry from the dairy or from their beef cattle buyers, and they spread that over the sandy ground, and when that dries out, it forms like a firm pancake on the surface of the ground, and that would prevent it from blowing.
You can raise particular strains of oats in that sand, but not other types of oats, and they do best if they are fertilized with fertilizer that have manganese in the fertilizer. Again, that's something that wouldn't have been known at that time, but today it allows for land use in alternative ways that make the land more valuable and make it more feasible to use it as a resource base than in the past.
So finally, early in the 1700s, the people of Broo surrendered to the wind and the sand. If there was any last great calamity to force the abandonment, history doesn't record it. More likely, the Broo occupants just finally recognized they couldn't go on any longer.
There will come a point at which your crops fail too often to make it reasonable to stay there, or your animals are too sick or just can't deal with it anymore. So the animals are fed up of being shot blasted by the sand all the time.
Moving from a large manor house structure with remnants of kind of high-class living to finally seeming as though there's a refuge in just one room where things have finally, the last person finally shut the door and left. And yet realizing that on the opposite side of the valley, life was going on somewhat close to normal.
There comes a point at which it is too hard. You're losing the battle, basically. And I don't think people would give up until they started losing the battle sufficiently frequently to make it impractical to carry on.
People went on living there until about 1710, but it became gradually impossible to make a living there, and in due course the landowner and the other people who lived there had to move to the margins of the estate.
I have the impression of gradually drowning tenants and covered by sand. The few estate records at the end of the story just say we can't have tenants here because we can't feed them grain, we can't give them material for their fires, and if we did that, what they would produce is not worthwhile, so just forget it.
It was unprecedented in Shetland that an environmental catastrophe of that type had happened. Never been known to happen before. In due course, the whole of the south of Shetland was affected in that way, but the estate of Broo was destroyed.
Sand no longer threatens life in Shetland as it did in the 1600s, but it has remained a constant companion for Shetlanders long after Broo was abandoned, as one local told the researchers.
Today, when you go there isn't that much blowing sand because there's been beach grass planted at some point over the area where the sand dunes are, and they're relatively stable. But he told us that when his grandfather was young, there was sand accumulating on the side of the house at that time, which was in the late 19th century. And there were windows that had been frosted by the sand impacting on them. So that was quite interesting because we assumed that whole area had been vegetated for quite a while and that sand hadn't moved in quite a while.
If there's some sand dunes in the Quendel area, and if you get a good gale of wind in the month of May, you can still see sand drifting over the ground. That's a fact. It wasn't so long ago that there was a considerable amount of sand. It was in the month of June where we had a gale a few years back, and it went straight across the road where it was very clearly seen.
Were some, I don't say rumors, but statements that these dunes recovered very quickly, which I found impossible practically. But once we dated them, the contemporary sand dunes there, which are 9-10 meters high, formed since the last event. They completely accumulated and reformed since then. So people locally had some remembrance that this was an area that changed profoundly but recovered profoundly and really relatively rapidly.
The House of Broo was likely at least in part a victim of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling. It's now being uncovered during a period of unprecedented global warming. Can this historical climate change catastrophe help prepare us for those that may come in the 21st century?
The landscape and climatic conditions that we're experiencing presently are not necessarily what were there in the past or what we're going to experience in the future. At the time that Broo was in its so-called heyday, it was one of the most valuable properties in that part of Shetland. And now it's abandoned and it's inhabited by very few people, lots of rabbits and lots of sheep. And so to see that change come about as a result of something that the people who lived there, I'm sure, did not expect, is a bit sobering.
So now we're aware also that not only was the climate warmer and cooler in the past, but also we're modifying the climate by increasing the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and forcing it to warm. So this concept of a sort of an invariant climate, which you can work out these various extremes, is incorrect. And really, when you're designing something, you've got to take into account the past record and the potentially changing future record in designing anything. You can't just consider that the 1 in 100 year event is going to continue being the 1 in 100 year event.
Well, I think one big lesson is that we should think of environmental changes that come with climate change as something that can vary enormously on a local scale. You know, that some properties or some ways of life or some economic activities, even on a local scale, may be affected much more in one place than in another within a region. And particularly when you look at coastlines and complex coastlines, you know, houses on one bay may be much more strongly affected than on another part of the neighboring coastline. And so it's possible, you know, one possible lesson is that there has to be a certain amount of accepted complexity in adaptations and approaches to managing the environmental management challenges that are coming.
As for Shetland, the islands don't need decades of constantly blowing sand to be a rugged, challenging environment. Between the never-ending winds and remote location, the Shetland Islands have existed on the outer edges of human habitability for as long as people have lived there. But the Shetlanders I met wouldn't have it any other way, and they know better than anyone how to turn these cold, distant islands into home.
And I've got a real sense of connection to this place because I've lived here. That's where this area is where my parents grew up, and most of our family stories and history is all in this one area. So I think all those different things together gives you a tremendous hold on the place, or maybe I should say the place has a hold on me.
The landscape and the light is all quite amazing to see. So I've lived here pretty much all my life, and there's still something new each day and each year to see, just with the way that the sea is and the being on an island.
I've lived here all my life. My family have been here since definitely from at least 1700, maybe for hundreds of years before that. So it's in my bones. This is where I live, where I want to live, even though the weather can be pretty dreadful at times. It's still my home, and as far as I'm concerned, that's it. It can be the best place in the world.